Looking at part two of chapter one, or what I call part two, just from the middle of page 12 to just to page 14. Let's go up to maybe age 4. Now a kid can ask questions. They're telling creative stories. They're making commands like give me this, sit down, don't do that. And they're learning several words a day as their vocabulary develops. Starting to learn things like passives, like instead of like saying like the car was fixed yesterday, or the window was broken by Billy, and that gets more as opposed to active sentences like I painted the wall. Relative clauses like the man who is outside is waiting for you, or the truck that I bought is red. Those adjective clauses. We have adverb clauses like I will call you if I have time, or I fell down because I was not being careful. That includes as soon as, while, all the time clauses, as well as although, because, and then the if clause, which we call conditional. Kids start to go into different social environments, like they have to go function in the store. They have to function at the doctor's office. They have to go to their parents' workplace or to a wedding reception. And as the social environments expand, then they learn to use language in those different environments. That's why when we teach ESL, a lot of times we're putting students in different environments like shopping or doctor's office, and trying to see if they can function in those different environments, which is kind of fun too. Kids are kind of aggressive on the playground, so that they learn a lot of like, give me that, don't touch me, get out of here, the aggressive language on the playground. Metalinguistic awareness, we call metalinguistic, is talking about language. So we can see that children at a certain point start to talk about language, like, oh, that's not the right word for that, or Johnny said this and it was funny because that wasn't the right word. Or of course when they get into writing, they point out spelling mistakes, which is metalinguistic. They're starting to see that language is something separate from just them expressing ideas, and they might start seeing like what's right and wrong. So a child is now exposed to thousands of hours of listening and interacting through their childhood years. It's very hard to duplicate that when you're learning a second language. It's hard to duplicate the thousands of hours of pure exposure to the language. Unless you move to that country, then you could get if you get a lot of exposure to the language. But oftentimes, even if you move to another country, you're still kind of communicating with friends back home, or you're communicating at home with your family who's with you. And it's not like you're totally immersed and alone in the new environment. So it's really hard to recreate that initial immersion into the language. 6-year-olds, you might say maybe first grade, because now you're starting to read and write, which increases your ability to learn language. And they're learning like hundreds of new words a year. It's interesting that adults, when we learn a foreign language, we start reading and writing right away. Almost like the first thing we often learn is reading. Whereas if you think about first language acquisition, we learn to speak and listen for 5 years before we even start reading and writing. So there is something natural about speaking and listening first, even though it's not like we don't want adults to ever see a book until they've learned to speak. Because it seems to be, or that could be one of the differences between adults learning a second language and kids learning a first language, is that we're going to have reading and writing right away, for better or worse. Another aspect of language is called register. That means formal language versus informal language. And children at a certain point start learning that they speak differently to their friends than to maybe like the principal. And if they start reading, they might notice that the language in the books is different or formal than the language that they're using to just talk. And so ESL students often aren't real familiar with that because they're just learning textbook English, and everything seems kind of formal, and then the dialogues seem kind of informal, but it's hard for them to distinguish that until maybe like they have a chance to travel or actually get into like the real informal slang and street talk, which they like when they start learning that. So that's the end of part 2 on page 14. So we'll finish here.